Hi there, it's June of 2015, and welcome to this edition of Take 5 with Tony. Today I want to talk about, is there such a thing as good trade policy? This very day, the U.S. Senate is debating whether or not to give President Obama so-called fast-track authority that would allow him to finish negotiations in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other trade deals. And then the House and Senate would get only an up or down, yes or no vote, no negotiations if they pass it. So trade is a very important issue right now. Folks like myself, and much better known people like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, well, we've been fighting against certain kinds of trade deals and certain ways of negotiating trade. But you know, when you criticize trade, you hear back, as I have, from the other side that, you know what, you all are just living in the past. You don't understand the global economy. You don't see how trade is vital to the prosperity of our nation, and so you are just trying to live in some sort of a bubble and not do any international trade. President Obama has said as much about his critics, and so too have conservative Republicans. Now, people like me are critical of certain ways of trading, certain types of trade agreements. Trade agreements that, for instance, make it entirely impossible for the public to know what's going on because they're held entirely behind closed doors, with hundreds of corporations having their representatives there, not only listening, but actually writing parts of the trade deal, suggesting drafts. Meanwhile, labor unions and labor advocates, environmental and health organizations, citizens group, they have little or no presence at these negotiations. Trade agreements that enable giant corporations to sue governments for policies that, for instance, protect children from smoking, or require big companies to clean up environmental toxins outside of a community, or that make it impossible to have buy local campaigns or local manufacturing efforts because it's considered unfair trade. Trade agreements that take those sorts of lawsuits that corporations are filing against countries around the world, and they're adjudicated not by elected officials, not in a court of law, but by private tribunals with a handful of corporate lawyers who make the decisions about whether or not these corporations have a claim. And trade agreements, most of all, that for the last 20 years have led to the loss of millions of good jobs and an overall decline in wages, particularly for working folks. That's the kind of trade that I oppose. Now, it does still raise the question, okay, if you're against that, is there such a thing as good trade policy? I would suggest that there could be, and that it should be based on three simple principles. First of all, that we should be trading for things that we need, things that we can't produce that well, things that fill gaps in our society and our communities. Right now, the way our trade agreements are structured, our exports to other countries and our imports back from them, well, they're like two ships passing in the night. Take beef, for instance. Over the last 12 months, Americans farmers have exported 2.7 billion pounds of beef to other countries. Sounds like a lot. It is. But you know what? During those same 12 months, we've imported 3.3 billion pounds of beef. Now, what sense does that make and what good does that do? Why not focus on trade for things that fill gaps and make us stronger? Secondly, trade agreements, fundamentally, their purpose should be to better the lives of people and strengthen communities. That's not the way it works right now. Right now, trade agreements are first and foremost set to expand corporate power and to protect large investors. So you end up with things like we have in the TPP that actually increases the length and the power of patents given to large corporations. Now, what that means is that big pharmaceutical companies, among others, can keep generic drugs off the market several years longer. That means they keep their prices and profits high. Meanwhile, poor people and working folks can't afford life-saving medicine. That's real, and that's what our trade agreements do now. Last point. The trade that we engage in, the negotiations that lead to it, should be conducted in the open. They should be transparent for all to see. Now, you'll hear from people, oh, no. We've got to be able to do these deals in secret because we're trying to get the best possible deal we can with those other countries. We have to negotiate in secret. Well, I mean, think about that. Who are we sitting down and negotiating with in secret? Those other countries that we're trying to get a good deal from. They know what we're proposing. They make their counter proposals. That goes back and forth. The only people being kept in the dark in these trade negotiations are you and I, ordinary citizens, average people, workers. I favor trade that makes people's lives richer and communities stronger. We could develop trade agreements that do just that instead of simply expanding the power and profits of international corporations. Thanks. See you next time.